Hello, and welcome to another episode of Dead Times, the only horror movie podcast recorded in the men's room stall at a major movie premiere. I'm your host, Peter, and with me, as always, is my sober sister, Tim. Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing just fine. Thanks for having me. I am a sober sister. That is.
Uh, yeah, I do call you when I'm drunk all the time to drive me around.
Hmm. Yep. Which is really inconvenient because you live in a completely different state than me. Like it really.
Yeah, I'm usually pretty sober by the time you finally get here.
Yeah, it doesn't really make any sense at all.
It's an odd system, but it's one that works.
Hmm.
And tonight we're going to be talking about Scream 2, the first sequel that we're actually doing. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, I guess that's true, isn't it?
Yeah, so this first question is a little unfair because you only watched Scream like a week ago. Um,
Hmm.
but did you miss these characters? Were you excited about re-entering this world?
Yeah, actually. Yeah, I was. And I was glad that everybody showed up again. And I was disappointed that Randy isn't in too much of it after a certain point. Although while he is, it is lovely. Yeah, and I was curious as to how they were gonna, because I knew from you that the protagonists in these movies were more of a constant than the killers, and I was curious as to how that was gonna work because I did really want to see these characters again. I was excited about that, but I wasn't sure how that was going to make sense, and it makes total sense for this movie certainly because it's all still directly tied to the events of the previous movie in a way that is still really clever. So I'm even more curious now that they've sort of, because this is sort of the obvious way in retrospect that you would pull that off and that you would have the events carry on while not having the same people be the murderers because they died at the end of the last one. So now I'm even more curious as to how the other two pull that off.
It is very much like this is the same story continuing on, even if I don't. Well, it is repetitive in that it is the Ghostface killer again, but it is just a direct continuation of the first movie story with just a year or two break in between it.
Right.
Let's talk about the first 12 minutes of the movie, which is, again, sort of a prologue to the rest of the movie.
Yeah, another standalone.
What'd you think about that first 12 minutes?
Well, it's not as perfect as the first 12 minutes of the first film, but I did think it was really smart. I thought it was clever in that it still incorporated the topic of scary movies into it.
Mhm.
But in a completely different way than the first one did. So I thought that was really smart.
Yeah, this movie begins with Omar Epps and Jada Pinkett Smith's characters attending the movie Stab, which is based on Gail Weathers' book about the original Scream. So we're going pretty far up the rabbit hole of metatextuality here.
Yeah, and also like that was pretty quick. Like
Mhm.
Gail wrote and published and sold the rights to and had her book adapted in the space between these movies,
Well, if there's
which is pretty quick legwork.
well, if there's one thing Gail will do, it will be chase after money.
This is true. Also, like I'm pretty sure that because the movie Stab, like it looks. One thing that I did appreciate about the glimpses of it that we get is that it's not like a ridiculously poorly made. Like it looks like a fine enough movie, but it looks and has been marketed like a slasher movie. And in that first 12 minutes, fans are receiving it like a slasher movie, but it's about actual people who died like a year ago. I
Yeah,
don't think that happens. Like there's not,
yeah,
like 7 months after after the shooting in the Dark Knight Rises screening, there wasn't a movie about that released as like a slasher movie.
yeah,
I'm pretty sure that didn't happen. My memory isn't the best, but I'm pretty sure that has never happened even once.
yeah. It is kind of in horrible taste. The fact that everyone is wearing
A worse possible case.
the fact that everyone's wearing those ghost face masks and miming killing each other in that theater is pretty poor taste, considering the fact that this is about within the universe of the movie. It's about something that legitimately happened, and a bunch of people who very much got murdered. It's all we find out later on in the
Yeah,
movie
in
that
that town.
yeah, we find out later in the movie that that Gale embellished certain details of her book to make it more grisly and tawdry, basically.
Which would be pretty hard to do, given that Gale actually was in the slasher movie.
Yeah, but yeah. So what?
How one could look at the events of the first Scream and be like, oh no, we need to add some drama here. This isn't can't make this too mundane and realistic.
Yeah, and the whole thing actually. My favorite thing about Stab is that it just sort of continues on throughout the movie and winds up becoming weirdly important to the conclusion of the movie because the one killer's motivation is entirely about Stab.
Yeah, which I thought was very clever, very 90s, as one character puts it.
Yeah. And they use the movie Stab to deliver exposition about what happened in Scream that is vitally important to the conclusion of Scream 2.
Oh yeah, I didn't even think about that because I saw Scream 1 so recently. Yeah, I wasn't even because so I remembered everything so well. It was also fresh, so I didn't think about that. Yeah, it does function as sort of a previously
Because, well,
there's this
first,
running previously on Scream throughout the whole movie.
yeah, in the first movie, Sydney makes a joke about the fact that she'd probably be played by Tori Spelling in the movie. So, of course, she's played by Tori Spelling in the movie
Yeah,
Stab. And they literally redo the scene where Sydney and Billy are talking in the school, where Billy talks about his mother leaving him. Billy, of course, is played by Luke Wilson.
yes, I was I was so happy about that.
And we find out through dialogue, although they never actually show it, that that Dewey's character is played by David Schwimmer.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think
which is
anyone.
pretty hilarious given his leading lady.
Yeah, yeah, I don't think that anyone in the main of the characters is, except for Gail, who's making apparently ass loads of money off of this movie. I don't think anyone was happy with their portrayal in Stab,
Yeah,
because Randy certainly wasn't happy about the fact that he was played by apparently some nobody. Poor Randy.
yeah, he listed some extra who's probably a real dude that he was actually referring to.
All right, so getting back to the prologue, we have Jada Pinkett Smith, we have Omar Epps, and they spend a lot of time talking about scary movies and the role that black people play in them. I was surprised that they didn't mention that the tradition of black people, of the black character getting killed first, because we have a movie with, well, actually, there are four black characters, of which two of them are the first killed.
Although, but somebody does remark on that later on. Somebody remarks on that very explicitly, which is Gail's new cameraman.
Yeah, Gail's new cameraman is terrified about what is going on, considering the fact that he signed on to work with Gail without actually reading her book.
Yeah,
And as a
yeah.
graduate,
And later he's like, okay, and I admit that was an oversight. Like I should have done that.
yep. So those two characters are attending the premiere of Stab, which is bonker balls, since everyone is in the theater wearing ghost masks and miming stabbing each other, throwing popcorn all over the place.
Yeah, which is just douchey behavior for a theater in general,
Oh yeah, no, that cleaning up that theater would be a nightmare.
and it will be, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
Zing.
Phil Stevens, Omar Epps' character, goes to the bathroom where there are the urinals are occupied by people in ghost face masks. So he goes into the stall, hears some weird noises coming from the stall, and like leans in. I think he thinks sex is going on in there. And then bam, knife to the head.
Yep.
R.I.P. Phil. Meanwhile, Maureen, Jada Pinkett Smith's character, well, she got her popcorn, which she really wanted. And she's busy yelling at the screen, giving advice to Heather Graham, who is playing Casey from the first movie, who she thinks is her boyfriend, sits down next to her. She gets scared and then winds up finding blood all over his clothes. He stabs her in the middle of this, or he stabs her in her seat, and then proceeds to keep stabbing her and keep stabbing her and keep stabbing her until she dies right in front of the screen. Meanwhile, everyone else thinks it's just a funny gag.
It's like a metaphor
Mhm.
for society in some way,
Mhm.
except that I'm pretty sure that no, also something that has never happened is people being too preoccupied with watching horror movies to notice actual murders that are happening.
Yeah.
Like I don't like it feels that the scene felt like social commentary, but for a social issue that doesn't exist. That it was like showing how you see all these people that are goofing off watching these silly horror films while actual horror is going down and they don't even notice it.
Hmm.
But like as a culture, when horror actually does go down, we seize upon it, and it becomes all that we talk about on 24-hour news networks, and we apparently adapt it into actual movies,
Hmm.
which I was unaware of.
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of borderline horror movies that are based on like Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, but Stab, the movie within the movie, really takes it to a slashery place that those kind of movies usually don't.
Yeah,
So, do you have any final thoughts about our prologue here?
the ending is really nice with her climbing up in front of the screen. Everybody kind of stops what they're doing, looks over, realizes what happened, and then she falls. Like that was really well shot. It was a really well paced sort of finale to that sequence. Yeah, and it makes it just like the first one. It makes a good little standalone sequence, which I thought really worked. And it was nice to have that again as sort of a sign that we're back in the groove of things. Like, hey, we're back in this world. So we start off with another sort of separated little prologue where the Ghostface killer first makes his appearance. So I thought it was really cool that they did that again. This movie is full of things that are kind of repeated from the first one, but done in such a way that you're on board with it, and that you're sort of glad to see them again instead of being bored by them,
Hmm.
which I thought was really interesting, and I thought that was one of them.
Yeah, one of the things that I love about this movie, which is less noticeable, I guess, in Scream because we're being introduced to all of the characters for the first time, but in this movie, characters like Maureen and Phil and Sarah Michelle Gellar's character Casey, well, Cece, they all have very sort of rich and developed lives, even though they're just there to be murdered.
Yeah, like I was sad to see them go. Like they had a legitimately kind of sweet little relationship. They both seemed kind of smart. Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, nobody is token killable character in this universe,
Yeah, like
which is refreshing.
it is a mini tragedy whenever someone dies. No one's there just to die. They all had long histories sort of before them that keep or that become or that they mention and talk about and have wants and desires beyond just being alive for well not dying in this movie. And I think that's
Oh,
really
and I guess in each case for each movie, the prologue is sort of a clue to the killer's identity and motivation. That the reveal of who the killer is in each one coincides with understanding why the killer would have motive to do what they did in that first scene that didn't involve any of our main characters, which is really interesting.
all right. Well, let's get into the meat of the story. And we're at Windsor College, which is where Randy and Sydney are going to college. So let's talk a little bit about Sydney. How did Sydney change between Scream 1 and Scream 2?
Well, she's learned to be a bit more a bit more cautious around her significant others,
Oh, yeah.
which turns out to be ostensibly unfounded, but like this, if last movie, if the last movie made it clear that made it clear just by the way that it was shot that Sydney's boyfriend was actually the killer, this movie like cranks that up to 11. Like it leans so hard into making this guy just this horrible, obviously insane creep, and then it turns out he had nothing to do with it. The one that she was, because it's supposed to be this tragedy that the time when she was actually suspicious of her boyfriend, that it actually wasn't him, but it's not unreasonable to be suspicious of this guy. I don't think she can be blamed really.
No, they did layer it on pretty thick that Jerry O'Connell's character of Derek might be the killer. Um,
That was the biggest laugh I got in the movies. They have that exchange where she seems really suspicious of him, and they're backstage in the theater after she has her breakdown over the play, and they have this little conversation. She tells him that he needs some distance, and he seems kind of upset about this. And and he's like, I guess I'm supposed to be understanding, right? Yes. Okay. And he walks away, and the hallway that he walks down has this sign on it that says danger that the camera lingers on as he walks away. Ah, it's just it's fantastic.
Yeah, poor Sydney. She is a lot more paranoid in this movie. Um,
Rightfully so, though, as it turns out. It
yeah,
wasn't him, but it was this girl is kind of a disaster magnet.
yeah. But again, like, well, there is her little breakdown in her performance when she's playing Cassandra, but she is not someone who crumples or goes hysterical when confronted by this sort of stuff.
No, she's just a little more jittery this time
Hmm.
because she's been through so much
Hmm.
recently.
Yeah.
And has been given no opportunity to move on from it because of the media circus that has
Hmm.
surrounded it. It's a little hard to move on from your traumatic event when it's being made into a major motion picture.
Absolutely. Yeah, it is. And like that morning after Phil and Maureen are murdered, immediately there are reporters just camped out in front of her or in front of her house, just
Yeah.
waiting for her to give her speech. And well, literally throughout the entire movie is constantly talking about people wanting interviews with Sydney, people wanting to befriend Sydney because of the fact that she was the primary victim of the Woodsboro murders. Like it's all about the sort of media circus around Sydney because of the events of the first movie.
Yeah. Yeah, and how much more difficult those events are for her to bear because of that.
Yeah.
But she still copes, which is really cool. Even struggling with all this PTSD and this other this kind of extra attention, like yeah, she still remains a really strong character
Hmm.
and doesn't take shit from anybody. I like to think that buying that caller ID machine was the first thing she did the next day after the first movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's what I would do.
Well, she's obviously the template of the final girl, but she is one of the best versions that has ever been made, if not the best version, because she
Yeah,
is.
because again, you buy it. You buy that this person is a survivor.
Mhm.
She has endurance written all over her.
Mhm. All right, so let's talk about Randy, her classmate, and they have got Sydney and Randy have seemingly gotten very, very close, even if they are not dating, much to Randy's disappointment since the events of the first movie.
No, Randy, you'll never be the leading man.
Randy is his good old intense self once again.
Yeah, and is still still giving the movie that he's in Cliff Notes.
Well, he's very upset that he's in a sequel because he does not like sequels.
Yeah,
How do you like
yeah.
the running gag about uh, if there is a sequel that surpasses the original?
I mean, that's almost a little too cute,
Hmm.
honestly. I mean, it's still it still works and it was still funny, but
Hmm.
it's like it's again it leans like the bits that they have in this movie about because it's funny because this movie like structurally isn't as much of a deconstruction of the typical slasher movie structure as the first one is, but when it does make those sort of self-aware references like the first one did, it tends to lean even harder into them.
Hmm.
But not to the point where I was like, oh come on, but it does push at those a little bit.
So do you believe Randy might have been the killer this time around?
No, no, he was a teddy bear. He's fine.
He's just
Um,
very intense and very passionate about figuring out who the killer is.
yeah, and he's a really bright little guy, and nobody cares. Nobody nobody is interested at all in what he has to say, except
Except Dewey.
yeah, except Dwight. Yeah, and that I thought was the best sort of fourth wall leaning scene was their conversation about who it might be, and again about what the rules of a sequel are. Like that the body count has to be higher. the deaths have to be more elaborate, which is not true. I don't think. I don't think anybody has as much of an elaborate death as death by garage door.
Were you surprised that Randy died in the middle of this movie?
I was. I was absolutely surprised, and rather disappointed. I wanted to have his running commentary for the other two movies. Yeah, and he's yeah. I didn't think he was gonna die. I didn't think it was. I figured somebody might, but honestly, I thought going into it, I thought that Dewey was gonna die,
Mhm.
and so and I was really surprised at the end when it turned out he didn't.
Yeah.
Because I thought he had had tragic death written all over him. Because like Randy, like what is, like Randy can't die tragically.
Mhm.
Like there's nothing. Randy had no unfinished business. There's no. Well, I mean, he does, but nobody cares. Again, yeah, and I don't think Sydney mentions him throughout the rest of the movie. So yeah, I don't. Yeah, but I wasn't expecting it at all.
One of the interesting things about Randy's death is that it is a huge turning point for the entire franchise, in that it is basically the first time Gail feels bad about someone dying.
Yes.
Like, she is visibly upset about the fact that Randy has been killed, which goes a huge way to humanize her, that she actually cares about another person for completely non-mercenary reasons.
Yeah, and it's a little late in the proceedings, I feel.
Mhm.
Maybe maybe would have been nice to not be a sociopath when dozens of other teenagers were being murdered in your immediate vicinity. But I love, and I love that that's like the only gesture of good faith Dewey needs to just put everything aside.
Mhm.
Then he was like, "Oh wait, you actually, you actually might feel bad if a puppy was strangled in front of you. Let's bang."
So let's talk about Dewey. Dewey's back. He is grievously injured from the first movie, and he is ready to take up with Gale again.
And Dewey is awesome in this movie. Like Dewey is the man. Like he's again, I like in this movie how everybody has sort of weathered the events of the previous movie in different ways and to different degrees. And aside from Sidney, Dewey seems to have really taken it the hardest. And he's a lot like there's nothing really. He doesn't have a lot of really comical moments in this movie. He's pretty down to earth. He's taken everything pretty seriously most of the time. And there's not it's not like in the first movie he was doing pratfalls or anything, but there was you did kind of get you had the understanding that that he was pretty new at this, that he hadn't weathered a lot of police work yet. Whereas like here he's already starting to seem a little world weary,
Mhm.
which I thought was really cool to see.
Well, Dewey, he is trying his hardest to save everyone in this movie, even though, again, he is extremely injured from the first movie.
Yeah.
I'm really curious whether it was David Arquette himself or just they wrote him that, oh, Dewey can't move his arm much and is limping, but I think it's very effective that he's so physically debilitated in this movie.
Yeah, and given what he goes through at the end of this movie, I'm curious to see what shape he's going to be in at the outset of Scream 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, he's not just physically injured, he's emotionally injured because he feels like Gail betrayed him. He's very upset about her portrayal of him in her book.
Yeah, which she did.
Yeah.
Like that was pretty shitty.
Because again, we said that like his archetype in the first movie is sort of the incompetent police officer, and you have mentioned already that he was sort of naive and more funny and lighthearted. Gail apparently made those sort of aspects of him heightened to an impressive degree in her book, which ignores the fact that in the first movie he was genuinely a competent character. He just wasn't in a position necessarily to do much about the events.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and it's helpful that knowing the events of the previous movie that that like okay, yeah, he wasn't he wasn't exactly on top of the situation all the time, so it's not ridiculously inaccurate to describe him that way in the book, but it's still a nasty thing to do
Hmm.
to somebody who she knew cared about her.
Yeah. Which, and seemingly Gale did genuinely care about Dewey because she sort of wants to pick up the romance or whatever they had from the moment that they first meet in this movie.
Yeah, which yeah, I don't that's that takes a lot of nerve.
Yeah. Were you buying the Gale Dewey romance?
Oh yeah. Yeah, and I bought it or at least wanted to buy it from moment one in the first movie. It totally makes sense given the personalities of their characters and how they fit together.
Hmm.
It is it's just and it's frustrating to know that Gail, whether intentionally or not, apparently did everything in her power to sabotage that.
Yeah. I mean, that does seem like a very Gale thing to do.
Absolutely, but that's why you're upset with her is because like, why are you so mean to Dewey? You were supposed to kiss him.
Well,
You were
let's
supposed to have little mercenary reporter babies.
well, let's talk about Gale. In the first movie, I made a comment about how Gale is the most 90s anchorwoman to ever live. In this movie, they styled her as the devil. Like, that is some amazing hair and makeup going on right there.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah, which is the last thing Dewey says to her in that first scene where he's put his foot down, he's storming away. He's like, "Oh, and Gail, nice streaks."
yeah. She has she has Courtney Cox's jet black hair with red streaks in them. She's always wearing all black. She's got that bright red lipstick. Yeah, she is designed to look like pure Satan. It's an amazing look.
Yeah, which is funny because she is a likable character for a greater percentage of this movie than the first one.
Hmm.
It's really just it's kind of it's bothersome what she did in her book, and it's angering the way she talks to Sydney in that opening scene where
Hmm.
she gets punched again. Um,
Were you excited for the punch?
yeah, and I knew it was coming, and I was like, how are they? Again, that was another thing. I was like, how are they going to do this in such a way that I still buy it? But like, as soon as the scene started, I was like, it has to happen. Like, it's not. There's no other way for this scene to end.
Yeah,
Uh,
Gale and Sydney still hate each other so much. And I feel like Gale genuinely delights in torturing Sydney the way she does.
yeah, which is pretty sick given what Sydney has been through.
Uh,
It's like, why? Surely there are teenagers to pick on who didn't see a bunch of their friends get murdered.
yeah, Gale is, again, she is an incredibly complicated character, and
Yeah, and
I.
that's what I was gonna say is that like after those initial interactions, like for the entire second half of this movie, like you're pretty much with Gale,
Mhm.
which is not really true until like the very end of the first movie,
Mhm.
which is really interesting.
Because she does start off this movie as mercenary as she was in the first movie, because, again, she has the classic line about, no, you shouldn't cancel this movie. It's going to break box office records with all this free publicity. Like, I'm assuming Gale gets some points off the back end of this stab movie.
Yeah, yeah, it's adapted from a book that she wrote,
Hmm.
so heck yeah, she's gonna.
After they sort of work through that first, her conflict with Sydney, her conflict with Dewey, then she does become a much, much more sympathetic character. Were you sort of rooting for Gale by the end of the movie?
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's funny because because since she had this sort of turnaround at the end of the first movie, I was going into the movie wanting to root for her.
Hmm.
Which is why it's so frustrating that she's still kind of an asshole at first. And so yeah, and I'm curious again. Everything about this movie makes me curious about where the franchise is going to go. I want to see how. I'm probably the most curious about what they do with Gale in the remaining movies.
Hmm.
Just because again, she's probably the most complex character and has the most potential for evolution, at least from where I can see.
Yeah,
Um,
as we said in the first movie, she isn't sort of one of these stock characters from these kinds of movies. She's sort of a visitor from a completely different movie, and the way she acts, you expect her to be sort of fairly quickly killed off in both these movies, and she's not.
Yeah, well, I didn't think that she was going to die in this movie.
Mhm.
But yeah, I spent the whole first movie wondering why she hadn't died yet.
Mhm.
I mean, yeah, she's a really unique character. She's probably my favorite character in the franchise so
Mhm.
far.
Well, she definitely gets
Just
all the best lines.
yes,
All right, so Gail brings with her Cotton, who was the guy that Sydney had accused of raping and murdering her mother in the first movie.
which
And
I don't know why he seems like such a sweetheart. How could you possibly think that this man would ever do anything?
which again, he was played for like 2 seconds on TV by Liev Schreiber in the first movie, and now he's this major character in this movie. I
And
know.
is there to make Gale seem incredibly likable by comparison.
All he wants is to do a Diane Sawyer interview, and he does not know why Sydney won't do the Diane Sawyer interview with him. Liev Schreiber definitely plays as creepy as I think Liev Schreiber is capable of doing. If Liev Schreiber could just rip off his face and reveal a lizard underneath it, it would make total sense with how he acts in this movie.
Yeah, he's doing Lecter a little bit.
Which, and Cotton's another character that's just incredibly odd because, again, he doesn't really add anything to the movie for most of the movie. He's just there because of the fact that he wants to do this Diane Sawyer interview with Sydney.
Yeah, well, and just in general, just once his 15 minutes of fame as recompense for the time that he spent in jail before he was cleared. But yeah, he's just clearly seems to be, especially given how the ending plays out, does really seem to be kind of a psycho. Yeah, you start to figure it's like, okay, maybe we know that he didn't actually kill Sydney's mother, but maybe jail was the right place for this guy. Like maybe Sydney actually did us all a favor.
Yeah, he is definitely an oddball, and it feels he borderline stalks Sydney in order to constantly be running into her in order to talk to her about this
He
stupid.
he, he stalks her, he corners her, he basically assaults her in public in the library, which
Yeah,
is not the place to do that. Just yet another creepy asshole in this movie, of which there are several.
which one of the things about this movie is that I really kind of want to check where all these actors were in their careers because this movie is filled with famous actors who are doing weird bit parts.
Yeah, like Luke Wilson, which I was so excited about when he cropped. I was like, "What, Luke Wilson? What are you doing here?"
Yeah, I mean, this is a movie
The
with.
Bojack. What are you doing here?
I mean, this is a movie where Joshua Jackson plays just a random guy in a classroom. It has Timothy Oliphant in it, Rebecca Gayheart, Portia de Rossi. Like
Oh, that
this,
was her.
yeah, that
I
was
wonder.
Portia de Rossi.
Okay, yeah.
Like there are so many. Sarah Michelle Gellar. There are so many people in this movie that a lot of times with these sort of mystery movies, you can tell who the killer is because they will be whatever is the most famous actor that is only playing sort of a bit part. And that's
Right.
every actor in this movie. This movie is the lock that unlocks basically the last 20 years of acting.
I mean, this is where it all started.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about one of the most intense scenes that I think I've ever seen in a horror movie, which is Gale and Dewey in the college building.
Yes.
Did that scare the shit out of you?
Yeah, that was like some Hitchcock level shit. Like just how, because it's such a weird setting. Like I don't know why. I guess I don't know how realistic it is because I didn't go to high school. I mean, college. But like the architecture is so weird that it's like it's like a maze, and so you really you never are allowed to have a sense of where the killer is, and of how safe or vulnerable Gale and Dewey's positions are. Yeah, because you don't really understand the layout. And of course, having seen the first movie, you know that there could be and probably are multiple killers.
Mhm.
And this setting really sort of enhances the paranoia of that. Because out in the open, there could be as many killers as you want, and it wouldn't make too much difference. But in this really enclosed, sort of claustrophobic, not very well defined space, you suddenly start really, really thinking about that, and trying to figure out how safe our heroes actually are.
Yeah, for just in terms of like frights, scares, tension, I think that scene surpasses anything in the original Scream and sort of any and most other horror movies. It is so intense just watching. A lot of it is you're focused on Gail and just watching her sneak around the sort of weird. They're in a radio station and she's just sneaking around sort of these walls, and you know the killer is right there, and you're constantly with Gail. When she gets frightened by the killer, you're frightened by the killer. It's so intense.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know if I would put it above the opening sequence in the first one, because that still stands as being really really intense and really frightening. But it's certainly the scariest part of this movie, and I think it's probably scarier than any other part of the first one.
Yeah, and then sort of very close in proximity to that scene is the scene where Sydney is being escorted by the police to basically a safe house with her roommate, and of course the killer attacks the car that they're driving in. They're in a police car, so it crashes into sort of this building with the killer in the front seat, and they have to escape by climbing through the window on
Yes. Yeah.
the window in the front seat.
So
Right.
good.
How tense was that scene for you?
That's it is. Well, first of all, I would like to say that we were assured earlier that those two detectives were the chief's two best men.
Mm-hmm.
This guy dispatches the two best men pretty quick.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that whole sequence is, and it's painstakingly slow.
Mm-hmm.
You can feel how careful they're being,
Mm-hmm.
just trying to climb over this person. Yeah, it's nail biting. Some of the dialogue in that scene is a little goofy, especially from what's her name, Sydney's friend.
Haley.
Yeah, Haley. She kind of diffuses the situation by once every 15 seconds just going, "Oh my god." Yeah. Otherwise, it's an incredibly suspenseful sequence.
Were you with Sydney on her sort of being pulled in two directions of either ripping off the mask and seeing who it is, or escaping and surviving for at least a little bit longer?
Oh, I thought she totally should have gone back and checked.
Well, I mean, she does. It's just too
Well,
late.
yeah. Well, yeah, but no, yeah, take that opportunity.
Mhm.
And it's funny. I was thinking about that because none of the other, admittedly very limited number of slasher movies that I've seen, there's never a mystery as to who the killer is. Whereas in both of these movies, it's the central thread. It's the thing that's happening throughout the movie as we're trying to figure out who is this.
Mhm.
And so I was thinking that was really odd, especially for movies that are so much of them are about picking apart the tropes of slasher movies. That it's weird that both of them are sort of based around this trope from other movies primarily than slasher movies.
Yeah, the big slasher franchises, again, the killer is the star. So it's Jason, it's Michael Myers. The ones where there's sort of this mystery of who the killer is are sort of the B grade slasher movies that don't become franchises. Stuff like Happy Birthday to
Right.
Me.
Yeah, that's true. Although Slumber Party Massacre, we know who it is.
Oh yeah, and he is more than pleased that we know who he is.
Yeah.
So let's talk about our killers. Start with Mickey, played by Timothy Oliphant. What'd you think about Mickey?
I said earlier that it seemed like the movie was trying to make it really obvious that Sydney's current boyfriend was the killer, and I'm not convinced that that isn't exactly what happened because our man looks and acts exactly like him, and both of them act vaguely like Billy Loomis from the first movie. So it is kind of just the same sort of creep / jock archetype carried over from the first movie.
Yeah, definitely the first time I saw this movie, I was like, Mickey's the killer. And at no point did the movie disabuse me.
I wasn't, but it made total sense to me when it was revealed.
Because Timothy Oliphant definitely plays him as a creep.
Yeah. And again, that doesn't make it obvious because there are lots of jerky creeps in this movie, most of whom it turned out didn't murder anybody.
Yeah. And then Mickey's big plan is that he wants to get caught being a serial killer so that he can blame his serial killing on violence in the movies.
Because reasons.
Well, I mean, he is a
I don't-
serial killer, so I don't think his reasoning capacity is that great.
yeah, I just was there an end goal there? Was there a point to be made?
I guess that serial killing is his grand social statement, and he wanted Bob Dole defending him at his trial, which that's a 90s reference for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think it's funny because that is pretty much exactly what I would have guessed given the fact that the events of the previous movie are actually made into a movie in the sequel.
Hmm.
That given sort of the tone and the kind of deconstructionist angle of this franchise, that is exactly the motivation that I would have guessed.
Hmm.
It's weird. Both of these movies sort of fake you out about there being no conventional motive. You
Hmm.
know, in the first movie, there's all this business about how motive is incidental. And in both movies, it seems like the killings just happened because the bad guys are just people who had an unhealthy obsession with horror movies. And so you keep thinking that again that's going to be the point that the movie makes, which fits right in with its aesthetic. And then it turns it around and it has there be a killer that actually has a very conventional, very well defined, and not totally psychotic motivation,
Hmm.
which is really interesting. And again, it's sort of a weird move that again, because that's the other thing, is that by and large the people killed in slasher movies are just the people who were in the bad guy's line of sight. That it's just like getting run over by a car with no driver. Whereas in these movies everybody dies for a very well defined and personal reason having to do with the identity of the killer, which is really interesting.
Yeah, so let's get to our main killer, Debbie Salt slash Mrs. Loomis. Was that a surprise to you? Was she ever on your radar?
Absolutely, I did not even consider that as a possibility.
Yeah, I did not consider that as a possibility either. I was shocked. Which again, it goes all the way back to the first movie when, again, Billy Loomis's entire motivation is that his mother left him. And now we have Mrs. Loomis here, whose entire motivation is the fact that Sydney murdered her son.
It's a nice little family they had.
Apparently. Although, you know what? Mrs. Loomis, total hypocrite. She could have just not left the entire family. She could have gotten a normal divorce and had Billy for weekends like a normal divorced family.
This is true, and really, that's the lesson we can all take away from it.
Exactly.
All
Don't
of this,
abandon your children.
don't do it.
So what do you think about Mrs. Loomis?
Oh, she's awesome. Like she's
Laurie Metcalf turns in an amazing performance literally throughout the entire movie.
she
Like
has
the
a billion times the charisma of her her counterpart.
got a
And
lot more charisma than her son. Like I love how Debbie Salt is supposedly Gale Weathers' biggest fan, and yet just sort of delights in getting underneath Gale's skin.
yeah, and again, and then that ties in with that final reveal really
Mhm.
well. Yeah, it's again just like the first one. Like this is a really well constructed movie.
Mhm.
Um,
I'm assuming that Mrs. Loomis hated the way Gale portrayed Billy in her book. She's just got because she kills Randy specifically because of the fact that he said some mean things about Billy.
yeah, yeah, and it makes sense, and of course also Gale was involved
Mhm.
with the events of the first one, and so is involved with Billy's death. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's interesting. Again, that's not something that I would have considered at all. Is that okay? Yeah, if you want to threaten your main characters again after they killed the bad guy in the last one, then the logical thing to do is that somebody wants to avenge that death.
Mhm.
And again, that works so well and makes total sense as a way to carry on the story, but isn't something that I would have thought of, especially for this kind of franchise where again tradition is that the killings are random.
Yeah, I mean, Mrs. Loomis is there for some good old-fashioned revenge, and when her facade of being nice local reporter Debbie Salt breaks and psychotic rage takes over, it is a thing to behold on Laurie Metcalf's face.
She is so fun to watch, and is much more competent than any of the other killers in this franchise so
Mhm.
far.
Yeah, although they sort of all make the same mistake of starting their end game before Sydney is dead. Actually, before Sydney, Dewey, or Gale is dead.
Yeah,
Like that's right up there. Or her getting rid of Mickey is sort of right up there with Billy and Stu stabbing each other in. Maybe that should wait until Sydney's dead, and then you should do that.
Yeah, that would have been the right move. But otherwise, like she really remains on top of the situation,
Mm-hmm.
whereas both killers in the first one and our secondary killer in this one are sort of constantly panicking because things are just about to get out of hand,
Mm-hmm.
and then they eventually do, which is also fun in its own way.
And then were you surprised that who turns out to be the hero of this movie?
Yeah, very. And again, hero would be a pretty subjective definition here.
Yeah, because
Um,
Cotton shows up at the very end of this movie and gets a gun while Mrs. Loomis is holding a knife to Nev Campbell's throat. So
yeah,
Nev,
and like all sympathetic, compassionate human beings, when somebody being threatened by a serial killer is yelling, "Please, please save me," it just sort of wanders over and is like, "Oh, you want me to save you, huh?"
yeah, I bet that Diane Sawyer interview is looking really good right now.
Yeah, remember that thing that I really wanted you to do? You want to maybe have a second thought about that?
Well, I mean, she gives him what he wants, and he has amazing aim because he takes out Mrs. Loomis like that. Good old
Yeah, which
Cotton.
yeah, which I suppose is commendable. Again, psychopaths tend to have pretty good aim. I imagine he practiced on a lot of baby squirrels. And and the other thing that I'm wondering about, because I imagine Cotton will continue to be a factor, at least in the next movie. And what I'm wondering about is because, as it turns out, Gail was around for that whole exchange. She didn't see it because she wasn't on the stage, but she was conscious, probably. I'm wondering about that, because that isn't kind of story that Gail would want to let go, regardless of it being the right thing to do. So I'm interested about that. Maybe that won't come to anything, but yeah, I'm curious to see what happens with Cotton in the next movie.
Yeah. So, what are your thoughts about Scream 2 as a whole?
It's really fun. It's not as good as the first one.
Hmm.
If for lacking the novelty, if nothing else.
Hmm.
It's also you can tell there's a higher budget, and I think that works slightly to the movie's detriment, because the first one was kind of slick but also kind of grungy
Hmm.
a little bit, and it felt like this really cool sort of innovative but kind of scrappy operation.
Hmm.
Even though Wes Craven is this veteran of the industry,
Hmm.
it wasn't exactly underground, but it felt like, hey, this is this kind of cool thing. It's like it's like when an alternative rock band first makes their first major label record.
Hmm.
It's like suddenly the cameras are better, there's more budget for the music, the cinematography is a little more conventional. It's still really fun. It doesn't feel quite as unique as the first one, if for nothing else than because we have the first one to compare it to.
Yeah.
Um,
How do you feel about it as sort of a narrative continuation of the first movie?
on that ground, I think it's fantastic.
Hmm.
There really isn't a single thread from the first one that it doesn't carry on in some way. All the characters are kind of dealing with the same thing. All of them are reacting still to what happened in the previous movie. As a sequel, it functions really brilliantly.
Yeah, I mean, you do feel like this is, well, obviously at the time it came out, you could assume that there would be a third movie, but it very much feels like either sort of the second novel in sort of a book series or like the second chapter.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel like an end at
Mhm.
all.
Yeah.
Like you feel like the first movie could have sort of stood on its own, whereas this one, okay, more is going to happen.
Hmm.
Which I guess is because they had to see how well the first movie did
Hmm.
to see if they were going to get sequels or not. And when it became this phenomenon, then they're like, okay, we can start thinking ahead a little more, and we can be more confident that we're going to get to make another movie.
Again, well, as now we're down to just Sydney, Dewey, and Gale, but those are incredibly rich characters.
Absolutely.
And you can definitely feel throughout this movie that where this movie ends is obviously not going to be sort of the natural conclusion to those characters' existence.
Yeah, exactly. In a way that the first movie could have, it would have been slightly disappointing, but this one absolutely could not. Like, you have to, we have to see these characters again.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Um,
think I think this movie comes to a very natural pause in where all these characters and their relationships with each other are going to be.
sure.
But it doesn't. But it isn't like, okay, we can throw up the end and never see these characters again.
Yeah, I would be really disappointed if there were no more sequels. Also, and I forgot to mention this last time, but I support the now continued use of the song "Red Right Hand"
Mhm.
by Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, which crops up multiple times in both of these movies, which is an excellent soundtrack choice for a scary movie, and also sort of fits thematically because this movie is sort of a deconstruction of the slasher movie genre, which is largely concerned with evil, and Red Right Hand is sort of a song about evil in this very archetypical kind of vague vaguely universal and abstract way. So it fits in really well, and it's just a cool sounding song that really fits in the scenes in which it's used. So I like that came back. I like that it's sort of
Mhm.
so far at least sort of the unofficial theme song of the franchise.
All right, so let's get to our final segment, best death. Who do you think had the best death in this movie?
Probably Jada in the first scene because that's pretty spectacular.
Yeah, I was gonna
And
say
again,
more. I was gonna say Maureen's death too. I don't think there's a more iconic death, possibly in the entire franchise, other than Drew Barrymore's death in the first one.
yeah, I would agree. From what I've seen so far, yeah, it's again it's beautifully shot.
Mhm.
It
She
feels
has a. She's vaguely in like a Jesus pose.
yeah, yeah, it's weird. It's weirdly sort of poetic
Mhm.
and kind of grandiose for this franchise, but it works really well. It
Mhm.
feels like this weirdly significant moment in a movie series, which has so far, for the most part, been just a pretty good time.
Yeah. All right. So thank you for listening. And again, don't pick up any landlines, period, unless you have caller ID. Just don't do it.
Yeah, just it's not a good idea.
Mhm. All right. Bye bye.
But hidden in his coat is a red right hand.